Yo, it's me, Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus. I know it's been a while. Also, what the hell was that? It's a little creepy, am I right? I mean, I thought that was pretty creepy. What do you think, my buddy no face here? What do you think? Was that creepy? Yeah, he thinks it was a little creepy. You know what I mean? I mean, what can you do though? I mean, really, like, genuinely, what can you do about something like that? I don't even know. I mean, maybe we got a transmission from another dimension or something. Hope it was another dimension. That was really creepy. Anyway, I am back. I know it's been a while. Can't even remember when the last time I updated. Let's look down. Let's see what was last time I updated. Wow. That was a while ago. That was, what, 4 or 5 months? I mean, it feels longer, honestly. Granted, I wasn't, uploading super consistently before then, but I'm gonna try now. How well I succeed, yeah, you know how it is. But I'm gonna try and upload a little bit better this time. I have some, solid, well, saying I have some solid ideas isn't quite right. Regardless, my big issue is I've always wanted to have a thing, because the really successful YouTubers all have a thing that they do, a specific show or gimmick or whatever. But really, I don't think I like doing this. I like making the videos, like uploading them, and while I don't always get the best response, in my opinion, you guys could leave more comments. That's all I'm saying. What I really think is that, you know what, I'll just talk. Because I've seen, like, some of my favorite guys. You ever seen Teching 101? I'll leave a link to his channel. This guy is really funny, and he basically just talks. Occasionally he ad-libs, he does weird jokes, but he just talks. He's really good at that. So I think that's what I'll do. So I'll just talk. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about 2 things today, and I feel like I went on that introduction a little too long, but I always do. So I'm going to be talking about RWBY, Before the Dawn, and RWBY, The Fairy Tales of Remnant. I got both of these books. I ordered them. I pre-ordered them, actually, which makes it sad. I think I said a while back that I was going to do a review for RWBY Before the Dawn, but in fact, I think I said it I think I literally said it in my review for the first RWBY young adult novel, which was RWBY After the Fall. I think I literally said I would do a review for this book, but obviously I'm a little late, and since I'm a little late, I thought I might, just package my thoughts about both books in one video. So let's see how that goes, shall we? Books here. Let's talk about these. Now, I think when I reviewed the first book like over a year ago, and I think I said I made an individual video for that, and I gave my thoughts on the book. And I think I said I would do a review for this one when I got it, and I got my copy a while ago, and it took me a little while to sit down. I think I read this about at the end of August. Yes, I know, it's almost the end of September. It's been a little while. And funny thing too, I got a sunburn while reading the first book, and I got a sunburn while reading this one too. That's what I get for reading on the beach, but still. And as you can probably tell by just looking at my face, I'm a very pale dude. If don't tell me it might mean that I'm don't say anything about that. Outside of, wow, Mike, you're very, very pale. I don't care. If you're concerned, thank you, but I'm fine. Anyway, when it comes to this book, I thought it was pretty good. Thoughts overall, I do think that the pacing was a little fast in certain areas, felt a little rushed. Wasn't terribly so, but I feel like maybe another 300 or so pages would have helped slow down the pace so that it didn't feel that way. Otherwise, I really liked it. I feel like we got a lot of good insight on Team Sun, who were slightly more in focus. We, of course, got some more stuff with Team Coffee. That was fun as well. I really appreciated that. We got a little bit more focus on Velvet as well, and because the first book didn't really, despite being all about Team Coffee, we didn't really get a lot about Velvet and her backstory, but we got a little bit about her, and I found her home situation, very interesting. It reflects very well on her character and shows who she is, especially in relation to her team and how her team has kind of become her family since her home life is not the best. Also, spoilers, I guess. I'm going to bring up spoilers for this book, I guess, and possibly this one. So one of the things that was brought up, we only got a little bit about Velvet, but I feel like like I said, I think it really reflected well on what we know about her character. We found out that her dad is a scientist in Atlas. And in fact, not only is to the point where I've heard people are speculating that he's one of the people in Dr. Polandina's photo, the one that also had Watts in it. Now, personally, I don't think that matters that much, and here's why. Regardless of whether he's in the photo or not, he refers to Ironwood as James, something that we know from Volume 7. Ironwood only really allows people to do when they consider him, he considers them a friend, and that means he considers Dr. Scarlatina's as a friend, and that's very interesting for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is, there's a possibility we might meet him, Dr. Scarlatina. I think his name was Will Scarlatina, but we might actually meet Velvet's dad in Volume 8. At least there's a possibility, because we're still going to be in Atlas, so we might actually get to meet the guy. That would be interesting and kind of fun if we did. I would honestly love it, because he seemed like an okay guy and an interesting character. Maybe not the best husband or father, but hey, I've seen worse. Hell, there are worse parents in this very series. Not the least of which is, let's say, Raven, who abandoned her daughter right after she was born and left her with her dad. Or, if you want to go to the worst possible parent in the series, in my opinion, Salem, who literally kind of murdered her daughters. I mean, not intentionally, and she totally blames Oz for it. And granted, Oz is sort of at fault for a couple of reasons, but he wasn't, he was trying to protect their daughters. Salem literally fired first, and Salem is the worst. I mean, I love her as a villain, but she's the worst. Anyway, I thought this book was really good. We got some interesting insight. I talked about Velvet a lot, or you could say. But let's talk a little bit about what we got out of Team Sun. Now, I found it very interesting how what we got out of this book is very reflective of what we already know about Sun's character in and of itself. The character Sun, not the team. Always confusing when that occurs. Anyway, when it comes to Sun's character, it's interesting how I think that what occurs in this book reflects on his character pretty well, in that it fits with what we know about Sun, and Sun is one of my favorite characters. And if I were to ever make a top 12, I would make it a top 12 because 6 is my lucky number, and I would double that to 12, so I could do 12 characters. But with 12 characters if I were to do a top 12 characters list, I would include Sun in there. I won't say where, but he'd be pretty high up. I really like Sun. Sun is one of my favorite characters from the show. Now, I think this book reflects well on him in that it shows his flaws a little more clearly, and while we got a little bit of that in the show, it shows way more clearly here, where Sun has a very unique way of looking at things, partially because he's evacuated and partially just because he's Sun. And as such, he's not the best team leader, and he's not always, he doesn't like to address his problems very directly. I know the feeling. I think a lot of us can relate to that. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. But I felt like it worked well with his character. It was also really interesting to get a little bit more out of Scarlet, because Scarlet we got very little of in the show, to say the least. We got a couple of lines from him. He was very briefly voiced by Gavin Free when he was introduced to us in the Vital Festival tournament in Volume 3 of RWBY. And while we got a little bit out of him, really not enough to discern a full personality. We got a little bit more later from something like the RWBY anthologies, where we found out he was gay. And it looked, based on certain things from this book, I'd say they're still leaning into this. Yeah, he's still gay. So, yeah, actually, that is funny. Would that make him the first canonical male gay character from RWBY? I know some of you are going to have some things to say about that, or at least I assume some of you would. But no, I think Scarlet might very well be our first canonical gay male character, which is interesting. I mean, Captain Hook always came off as a dandy. I know he's technically more based on Peter Pan, although both of his weapons are named Hook and Darling, respectively, which I got a kick out of that. I love that stuff. But yeah, it was interesting to see his personality full on in this book and his, how much, like, I don't know if he necessarily wants to be the leader of a team, but he definitely didn't want to be on a team that was led by Sun for most of it. And, if I were to say one thing that I think was 100% rushed in this book, I feel like his feelings about Sun as team leader, a little bit, could have used a little bit of work. I wasn't super butthurt about it, but I feel like it could have gotten just a little bit more work done in this novel. But what can you do? Anyway, what else was there? I will also say, what else? We didn't get much from Sage, which I've heard other people complain about that. I won't go too deeply, but yeah, we didn't really get much out of him. I will say, going back to Scarlet had an interesting dynamic with Coco. Oh, speaking of which, since that I brought that up. So when I first heard about this book after the Fall was getting a sequel about this one Before the Dawn, I was very curious. Obviously, I was hungry, for more RWBY stuff, and so of course I pre-ordered this book. I pre-ordered this one as well, and I pre-ordered, After the Fall. Like, when I first heard about part of the plot was that the teams were going to be split up and remade, I was very worried about that. One, because I wanted the interactions between the main characters, obviously, of Team Coffee, and of course now Team Sun to be also focused on in this book. I didn't really have a reason to be concerned. It turns out that wasn't that big of a focus of the book. It was actually just a ploy by the villain. So good on E.C. Myers for not actually going that far with it. I was actually way concerned about that idea. And granted, he would have gotten that plot idea from Miles and Carrie. But still, I was super concerned about that, and I'm glad it wasn't a huge focus of the book, because I was kind of nervous about that when I first heard about it. Let's see, what else is there? Oh, also, apparently there's Professor Rumple and Headmaster Theodore, who are apparently Rumpelstiltskin and Dorothy Gale, respectively. And I'm like, okay, I figured out the Rumple. I think they had put through a lot of hints at us that Rumple was Rumpelstiltskin in this book, but they didn't really give us a lot to figure out that Theodore was Dorothy. I mean, it's there. It's just, outside of the gender thing doesn't really matter because Rumpelstiltskin is also originally, male, and they made the character female here. No, so that gender flip didn't really matter. It's the personality. When I was in, and granted, Theodore is a character, and I am looking forward to seeing him in animation because, wow, he is something, and he is, not what I expected, but I gotta tell you, I was kind of happy to be surprised because, wow, so different from what I thought he was gonna be. And I was kind of into it. I liked what they did with his character. But, yeah, there's very little. I wonder if we'll see more Dorothy-esque iconography when we get fully introduced to him in the show. Because how heavily a character, when it comes to what they're based on, how heavily the character actually, how heavily they, resemble their inspiration. It depends when it comes to these stories. Some characters resemble their inspirations a lot, and others not so much. So I feel like it'll be interesting to see just how much Theodore actually resembles Dorothy when we actually get to the show. Maybe he isn't Dorothy. I didn't come up with this myself. I heard about it, and I'm like, from what I remember, it makes sense with the characterization here, what little is there. Maybe we'll get more. There's also some character stuff, or there's some threads that were left undone, weren't, followed up on in the book before it was done, and I'm really curious if they're going to follow up on this stuff when the show finally gets to Vacuo. I'm wondering if we'll finally follow up on some of these plot threads that weren't finished, but if not, yeah, that's a little disappointing, specifically one in particular. So I think I'll get more. I might I might do another video about this book, not necessarily just like some of the minor things I thought were interesting from it. But if not, then yeah, I thought it was pretty good. It was I think the first book was a little bit more solid, but this one is a good sequel, and I think that it did what it needed to do to continue the story properly. Anyway, let's go into this one. Oh, before I do actually, before I move on, I do want to talk about this a little bit more and just speculate on a couple of things. One thing, really. When this book takes place in relation to Volume 7 of the show, and the reason I want to do that is just because if we pay attention to this, it's very clear, to me at least, that this takes place before the end of Volume 7, and I'd be willing to say during, even to a certain extent. The question is how much. So we have to take a couple of things into account. One, Volume 6 of the show was very short, at least internally. Like, I know it was like, what, 13 chapters? But if you look at the show in Volume 6, you realize that not a lot of time passed. In fact, for the entirety of our boys and girls throughout that volume, I'd say about a week, probably less than a week amount of time took place. Not necessarily counting their travel time to Atlas. Excuse me. Excuse me, but not necessarily including their travel time to Atlas. So we can't be 100% sure just how long. Like, I mean, if I really looked at it hard, if I wanted to, all that matters is that Volume 6 only took place over a span of a couple of days. Now, when it comes to Volume 7, it more than likely took place over a span of a couple months, based purely on that one montage from the middle of the volume and everything else that took place. I'd be willing to say that a few months passed. No more than 2 or 3, really, in the grand scheme of things, but that's still a decent amount of time. Meanwhile, based on what I remember, this book, well, we have to take into account a couple of things with the first book, specifically that literally at the beginning of Volume 6, we see Sun and Neptune, and assumedly, because we don't see Sage and Scarlet at all, but we have to assume that they then traveled directly to Vacuum. Obviously, it took a little while, and exactly how much time it took them to get there doesn't really matter. We don't know exactly how much it was anyway, but taking that into account, it would have taken them a little while. Let's say it took them at a maximum a month, maybe a month and a half, to get to Vacuum. Now, according to this book, as far as I remember, it's like a month, maybe more than 1 month after the events of the last book. Now, taking that into account, and the idea that, say, Team Sun has only been at Shade Academy for about a month, that means that we'd, like I said, be somewhere in the middle of that 2 or 3 month time period during the montage we see in the middle of Volume 7. So before all of that crap goes down. So this book definitely takes place before all of the bad stuff happens at the end of Volume 7. We'll see when the time comes. But regardless, this is my thoughts on that. Also, just to leave you on a bit of a humorous note as we move on to this book, I know I'm stretching this, and yeah, I thought that was really funny. I don't know if any of you laughed out loud when you read that, but I certainly did. And man, does it explain a lot about Sun's character, let me tell you. Anyway, we're going to talk about this one a little bit more briefly. I read this fairly recently, a couple of days ago. This being the RWBY Fairy Tales of Remnant. It's pretty good, I gotta tell you. It works pretty well as just individual fairy tales. I've seen a couple of other people speculate about it. I'm not going to do as much speculating, but I will talk about each individual story as they were told in the book. So, and it's fun. So there's actually like a fictional forward, what is it called? Introduction. I'm sorry, introduction by Ozpin in this book, as well as a what's an afterthoughts as well. It's pretty cool. I'm sorry, afterward. Ozpin's afterward. It's pretty cool, honestly. It's like Ozpin himself, wrote this. Not wrote this. Well, kind of. He put all of these stories into a collection for the people of Remnant to read. And, you know, I love stuff like that. It's very meta. Anyway, let me get to the actual stories table. I'm looking at the table of context. I'll put up an image for each of the individual stories, specifically the most important, because each of them had like a piece of art. Each of them had a couple of pieces of art, but I'll put up the primary piece of art for each of these stories. So the first one is The Warrior in the Woods. And The Warrior in the Woods one, I don't think has any super strong significance for the whole series as a whole, except that it implies some stuff about the destruction of the people with silver eyes, the actual group, and it implies some stuff. I don't know how. Like, I'm not going to go into it because I'm sure other people have gone into it more. But I thought that was very interesting, and it doesn't become clear until the end of the story when we learn that the warrior in the titular warrior in the woods has silver eyes. But I got to tell you, when I read that line at the very, let me go to it. I'll actually read it out loud. The very last line of this particular story. Let me see. This particular fairy tale. Let me see. The group waited. He gazed into the fire. I fell in love with her the moment I saw her silver eyes. And I thought the character had silver eyes. I got that impression reading about it and how this, and hell, it's implied later in the story as well. Again, these are all short fairy tale style stories, of course, so not super complicated. But I thought she had silver eyes, and even the depiction looked like there's a drawing of this character, this warrior. There are two actually, but there's one of her face. Let me just pull it up for myself. Yeah, and while it's not entirely clear based on the way it was drawn, this character, it looks like she has silver eyes and she had silver eyes. So it's interesting to consider. I feel like there's some implications about the people with silver eyes as a people, as a distinct race among those peoples of Remnant, and I feel like there's definitely some stuff we don't know that might get explored later, or maybe not, I don't know. Now, the second story in the book is literally The Man Who Stared at the Sun, and what's funny about it is we got a sort of preview about it in this book, because Sun thinks about that and how it's one of his favorite, like, fables or fairy tales that he was told as a kid. And you know, and it's pretty good too. All of these stories are actually pretty good. The Man Who Stared at the Sun. I honestly love this. I found it quite humorous and quite poignant, actually. And I don't want to keep doing this, but I am going to quote not the story itself, but Ozpin put some notes in this at the end of each story, and they're all very interesting. And let me see. No, that's the notes for the next story. Let me find the notes. Almost here they are. Here are the notes for that one, and it's basically like let me see. This is from Ozpin's point of view. This is his notes on The Man Who Stared at the Sun. I am particularly fond of yet another alternate take which offers a simpler, yet classically vacuum twist on the moral lesson. Don't stare at the sun. So yeah, the fact that Ozpin is fond of that version, and that's essentially the version as told by Sun, ironically, in this very story. So yeah, I think it works pretty well, and I like that we got a little bit about it, got a character's perspective about it before this book even came out. In another book, also written, because this one was also written by E.C. Myers. It's cool to see that the guy can write more than just novels. The fact that he wrote this as well is actually very impressive. The next story in the book is The Shallow Sea, which is one of the fairy tales noted by Pyrrha when she was first told by Ozpin about the maidens and the magic and all that. And again, like so many other things about this series, we didn't get a lot about it at the time. But hearing this version, it's interesting to consider that it's basically an origin story, a creation story for the Faunus in-universe. And I like this story. It's pretty good. I will say, I'm not going to focus on this one too long. I will say that I wasn't super fond of it. I didn't think it was bad. Because there are two stories about the creation of the Faunus in this book, and I like the second one a little bit more. I like that one a little bit more. The Shallow Sea was pretty good, but it was a little too simple for my taste. I didn't really get a lot out of it. The next story is The Hunter's Children, and so this is an interesting. I came across this. As usual, after I go over a piece of media, I usually like to see someone else talk about that media a bit, because it's fun. Now, with Hunter's Children, this is not a thought I came up with on my own, but I heard about this. I can't remember from whom I heard this, but I thought this was an interesting thought, that each of the four children, as mentioned in the Hunter's Children story in this book, are a reflection of the four main characters of the show, that being the members of Team RWBY, being Ruby, Weiss, Blake, and Yang. So I don't remember which one represented which, and I don't want to go into too much depth about that. If I could find the source from where that idea stemmed, because it wasn't my idea, I'll leave a link in the description. But if I can't, I'll just, if I can at least find out who is a reflection of who, I'll put them up on screen. Anyway, let's move on to the next story in the book, which is The Indecisive King, or in parentheses, aka The King, the Crown, and the Widow. Funny thing about this, when I first read this, I thought it said window, because this is a problem of mine. Sometimes I see words and I either remove letters or add letters unintentionally. So I thought it said window until I read that there was a widow in the story. I was like, oh, okay, widow. Anyway, but the more interesting part, because this is actually one of my favorite of the fairy tales from the book. It's pretty good. I thought it had a good story, a nice rounded story overall, and it probably has the best depiction, in my opinion, of what is a classic fairy tale, at least based on my experience when it comes to fairy tales. It has so many of the tropes. Anyway, but I think this might be our first full glimpse of the relic of choice in the book. Because, okay, so what ends up happening, and let me just read the description here, if I can find that passage from the story. But in the book, it describes, it describes a man getting, the king getting a new crown. It happened that the king's grateful subjects sometimes brought him offerings, from food that they had prepared to livestock or precious jewels and gold. The king, ever humble, always encouraged others to give those truly in need, but he was also gracious and polite. It didn't hurt to accept their gifts, and then donate them to a good cause himself. One day, a man with wild eyes arrived with a burlap sack that held a gift for the king. When it was his turn to speak, he pulled a silver crown from the sack. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Specifically, the rest of the story goes on to describe the crown and how it apparently, if you put it on, you're shown a point in your future where you have to essentially make a choice of some kind. And that's part of the story. Now, whether this is actually just if this has anything to do with the relic of choice at all, I would be very surprised if it didn't, but if it doesn't, then it's just a really good story. But it seems to imply that the way the relic of choice worked, and I long wondered about how the relic of choice worked. I wondered about all of the relics and how they worked, specifically after we found out about Jinn and the way the lamp worked. Not only because it's a reflection on the classic story of a genie and the lamp, but also just because it made me wonder, like, okay, this relic works in a very specific way. How do the other relics work? Now, with the Relic of Destruction, it could be as straightforward as it being able to destroy just about anything or cause destruction in any way on a mass scale. That could be it. I'd be willing to wager. I've heard some speculate that the Relic of Destruction might be the most powerful. And that's debatable because of how you might define power. Because it depends, really. If you're talking about sheer power, then maybe. Because the Relic of Creation can do anything, except it has to do each task one at a time. So that in itself is also very interesting. But then there was the Relic of Choice. And that was the one I always had the biggest issue with, because it's like, what does this relic do? It was never very clear, because it's like, what does the thing choice have to do with a mystical ability? What could we do with that? And having it be that the crown allows a person to see into their own future and see a critical point at which they could either be making a really good decision or a really bad decision is very interesting, because I think that's a good way to use choice as a thing. And so the fact that it's represented as a crown is also pretty important, I think, because royals and kings in particular are notably usually depicted as having to make great and important and impactful choices. So that's a thing, and I think that's an interesting concept if that's the case with this. But we also have to take into account the description. Now, there's a crown, there's a drawing of the crown throughout the story, but it's gold and with rubies or like red stones embedded in it. But I think this is the one, the crown the king wore before, and I'm basing this on two things. One, the description in the book says the crown is silver, and two, because this would be an interesting reflection if it meant that. So when we were first introduced to Jinn, she said that she was a being created by the god of light. And as it turns out, both the relic of knowledge and the relic of creation both are gold with blue inlaid crystals of some sort, whether it be the appearance of glass in the lamp or the crystal in the scepter or staff. That is the relic of creation. So it would be interesting if they, like, two of the relics were created by the god of light and two of the relics were created by the god of darkness, and the relics of choice and destruction were created by the god of darkness and therefore looked more silver than gold. And that would be a very interesting difference between the two. And the idea that choice is associated more with darkness, probably because it's because you could easily end up with making the wrong choice. I could just be reading too much into this. I mean, this could just be a fairy tale, and the description could be largely inaccurate. We don't know. I mean, it's a book. It's hard to say exactly. So I think I'll move on from that one, but I thought that was very interesting because, like I said, I think it might be our first glimpse at that particular relic. But moving on to the Grimm Child, and the Grimm Child is probably the creepiest and the saddest story in this book. Well, maybe not the saddest, but it's definitely the creepiest, and it definitely gave me the appropriate level of chills having read it, and then even going into Osmond's notes and finding out that it's probably an exaggerated version of events when it comes to a certain type of Grimm that we have yet to be properly introduced to in the show. And the fact that this type of Grimm was brought up in the story itself implies to me that we're definitely going to see it in the show. I think we're definitely going to see it. It's called The Chill, and based on its description and what Osmond says it actually does, I would say it's probably even creepier than both the Nuclavy and the Apathy, respectively. I find those two are to be the creepiest types of Grimm, and I really like both, but I have to say, I think that compared to it, The Chill is by far the creepiest. I think it definitely has the worst effect. It sounds, and again, even when we were introduced to the Apathy in Volume 6, as creepy as they were, And what they did in the show was a kind of something, it was more of a unique case because they don't usually do things on that scale. A very specific series of circumstances allowed the Grimm to do what they did in that scenario. And as such, I don't think, I think comparatively speaking, with what the Chill has been described to do by Ozpin, it sounds way worse to me. That's my opinion. Your thoughts might differ, but that's just what I have to say. Moving on to the next one. The next one is the second of the Faunus creation stories in the book. And this is the one I like a little bit more. A couple of interesting things about it. For one, the description, and there's a god described in both, but the description of the god in the judgment of Faunus is a little bit more accurate to one of the god brothers, and specifically, it sounds like the god of light. It's the description given in the book sounds exactly like the god of light. And I will point out, if this is accurate, and I don't think it necessarily is because of what we've been shown in the last Lost Fable, because it doesn't necessarily match up timeline-wise, because the Faunus apparently didn't show up until after humanity was wiped out the first time, and if that's the case, then Faunus came later. Then that implies that, at least if this story was true, that the God of Light had come back, even though he and his brother had both left. And that it's really hard to say. I like the idea, but I do think it doesn't quite fit into what actually happened. But as far as creation stories go, I think I like this one most of all because it's just the most interesting to me. I don't know. I like the way it was told. I felt like it really reflected well on the nature of humans and Faunus and how things have gone over the last few millennia when it comes to these two species. But anyway, the next story is, of course, the Infinite Man. And the Infinite Man is, let me see here in the actual book, but it would appear that one is another one of the examples of Ozpin's many lives. In fact, based on the description, it describes at least 3 of his lives. And let me just see here. Here it is. First of all, this is some great holy-looking imagery, and it really reflects well on the idea of Ozpin, at least in the legends told. But and it's even said, this story is recorded by Professor Ozpin. And obviously, when you, the stuff that's, obviously who recorded it, sometimes it's from anonymous, sometimes it's, folklore that was told via word of mouth. But the fact that it's recorded by Ozpin, the story is obviously talking about him and, the wizard and the multiple lives and his experience. And, the description of, I am just a man and not a very good one, that reflects perfectly on Oz's thoughts on his own experience and who he is. And it also reflects very well throughout the story on how he's just trying to do the right thing, and and the lesson taught in the story in and of itself is one of the best ones throughout the book. In fact, it's one of the few stories in this book that I think has a very clear message, in that you shouldn't put your faith in one person above all else. And I think that works very well, especially not only with the story itself and with the lesson, but with its relation to the show and the mythology of the series as a whole. And I think that works really well. And it's very interesting to consider. And it's kind of tragic, really. The whole story is tragic. I knew Oz's story was already tragic, but as described here, is one of the most tragic parts of his life. And it's just one of the many mistakes he's made, as also described in this book, and as he himself noted. So it's a very interesting reflection. Excuse me. It's a very interesting reflection on who Oz is as a character, and his long history of wandering Remnant. But anyway, the next story in the book is that of the 2 brothers, and it's essentially it essentially focuses. It basically it's like a slightly more detailed version of the story told by Crow when we're first told about them in Volume 4. It's basically that, but in hyper realized detail. It's also a creation story for the whole of Remnant, and it also essentially tells parts of the Lost Fable as well, specifically the part about the gods just getting the hell out of there. And it's interesting, for one thing, but I don't think it's very accurate to the mythology, and here's why. There's parts that literally, well, let me just let Vegeta sum it up for me.
How did you know about the parts you weren't there for?
Yeah, because there's a part, specifically at the beginning, like, some of this could easily be construed by a person, and obviously this story had to have been told by a person at some point, but the part it describes at the beginning where there's an original dragon god who splits into two and becomes, separates itself in such a way that it becomes the god of light and the god of darkness, is interesting to me, because there's literally no way that a person recording this story should know about that unless they talk to the gods directly. And nothing about this story, it's very much a creation story in the way that most human creation stories are told. In that, or I should say Earth creation stories, to differentiate it, because Remnant has more than just humans, but based on the way it's described, it doesn't really make sense for there to be it just doesn't, like, unless, so I'm in my opinion, I think that one is like completely or mostly made up. I don't think it's got some parts of the story right, but otherwise it just sounds like a lot of bunk, in my opinion. But I liked the way it was told. I thought it was very good, and I thought it was described, and honestly, it probably has my favorite piece of art from the entire book, to be honest. Like, just the art depicting, let me go here. Let me just, I'm sorry, this book is very long. I'm not looking at the actual page numbers. I probably should. Here we go. So yeah, this depiction, this image here, is a beautiful depiction of the God Brothers and their natures, and it's basically implying, it basically gives it an implication about the dragon, quote-unquote dragon continents in Remnant, and that they are essentially the two gods. They're the gods. That's how they left things when they left this, and instead of just leaving, which is what they did. Yeah, literally, each dragon transformed himself into a new continent at one end of their world, and there the dragons still sleep, until the day that the gods will awaken and rise and judge. And that's not really what happened. I mean, maybe it is, maybe we don't know, and maybe that is really what happened, but no, it appeared like they just left. And all things considered, we have to assume that what Jin showed us in the Lost Fable, that's what actually happened. That's how the event actually occurred, and so no, they just left. The fact that there's a couple of continents that looks like dragons, just a coincidence. And in fact, I love how that being just a coincidence, I love how this is just the kind of thing I'd expect from the writers of RWBY, coming up with an idea about how to explain something that the fans have been speculating about for years, but in universe, it's an explanation in universe that doesn't really apply to our world, because it's just an explanation for the people in universe who have mapped the continents and all the land masses and see these two land masses that supposedly look like dragons, and decide, you know what? These are just our sleeping gods that will one day awaken and judge us. And I love that. That's very much the kind of thing that we would do in the real world. And that's why I like the idea of that, because it reflects on human behavior very, very, very well. Speaking of hyper, this is interesting, but the next story is the story of the seasons, and it's just the story of the four maidens, and kind of like how the version told to us by Oz in the world of Remnant is just a hyper detailed version, like as described by Oz, who obviously lived it because he is in fact the wizard. That version is the truthful version, whereas the version told by Pyrrha is just one of the more commonly known versions. It's pretty clear the version as told by Oz in the book is exactly what happened, or at least the most accurate version we've gotten so far, because it's basically exactly what happened in the World of Remnant short video, except it's way more detailed and way more. It also shows an accurate passage of time. It's just way more detailed on every level. So I'd say that's probably one of the most accurate stories here, probably because Ozpin is literally just recollecting exactly what happened and writing it down. And yeah, and this isn't the first time he does so, although I will say some of these stories obviously happened very accurately to, well, I'll get to that. I'll get to that at the end. But let's go to the next one, because this one is a very important example of this as well, is The Girl in the Tower, which is one of the other stories as described by Pyrrha in that scene where she's told about magic and the maidens. And The Girl in the Tower, as speculated by fans for a long while since we were introduced to Salem and then told her backstory, that The Girl in the Tower, it's basically the story of Salem. It's Salem's story. It's basically the beginning part of of Jin's narration from the Lost Fable about Salem and her story, but again, more detailed, and therefore the more accurate version. And the question, of course, I have is, one, where did this particular version of the story, because unless it's Oz recollecting stuff that Salem told him, and I wouldn't be surprised if he at least maybe fixed up the story a little bit to get it more accurate, I don't think that's what actually happened here. This is the version of the story told over a long time, because it ends essentially the same way the story ends. Let me go to it. Again, I keep going through it, but that's because reading directly from the book helps outline what I'm trying to say. Here, let me read exactly. The hero was surprised to meet a smart and powerful girl who shared his curiosity about the world and a strong sense of justice. Neither was eager to go their separate ways. "So where should we go now?" the girl asked. The hero offered his hand. "Wherever you'd like." The two fell deeply in love, planned adventures around the world, and lived happily ever after. Now, for those of us who have a very sharp memory, we remember that this is essentially the way Jin's narration went in the story in the Lost Fable chapter of RWBY Volume 6, except after this last bit and they lived happily ever after, she went on and she said, or at least that's how it should have ended. And that's more or less what Jin said. And yeah, because this is basically just the opening, an extended version of the opening of the Lost Fable, telling us about Salem's backstory and about how her parents met, and why she was locked away in the tower in the first place, and how really it paints her father in a way more sympathetic light than the version Jin told. Like, I mean, granted, he's still kind of a jerk and a little bit on the nut, like very greedy and on the nuts side of things, but he's definitely way more sympathetic character in this story than he was in the show. And granted, they only spent a couple of words describing him anyway, so it's kind of not that hard to make him more sympathetic. I'm just surprised that he is. And I wasn't expecting this, but this expansion of the story is very interesting. And one of the things I wanted to bring up, and I was going to bring up at the end of this section of the video anyway, but I want to bring up just that the way Oz describes certain stories in this book, specifically the ones he would have had at least some hand in, it's interesting because he sounds very detached. And that's really interesting. He manages, the way he writes, he's written these notes and all the other things in this book, especially concerning the stories that, again, have something to do with him personally. It's very interesting to me because it's written in a very cold or analytical and detached manner. Granted, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised because until The Lost Fable, we didn't really see how deeply Oz hid his feelings and his true opinions on certain matters. So the fact that he's able to, at this point, which obviously this would have happened before the fall of Beacon, it's pretty clear, honestly, that this, like, at least with the context of this story, he's able to, like, at the time, hide his thoughts concerning a lot of the events in question. And it's also interesting when it comes to the girl in the tower to just consider, because it's not something I really thought about, and this is something I would normally think about, but I thought that story was so well told, I didn't really bother. How did all of these heroes and knights know to come and try and rescue Salem in the first place? And as explained in The Girl in the Tower, it's because she apparently wrote letters that were blown away in the wind and were discovered and read, and a bunch of people came. And it explains why there were all those fallen weapons outside of the tower when Ozma finally showed up to rescue Salem. So it's a detail about the story I never really thought about that much, but I like that it's outlined here. And the final detail of this is basically another creation story, except this time it's the creation of the moon. It's an explanation for why the moon exists and why it's shattered in Remnant. And I like this story. We, of course, know exactly why the moon is actually shattered, but this story is actually a really great explanation for it, and the idea that the moon is just the original sun that was broken and was brought down to Remnant, and they had to build a whole new sun, and it's brighter, and the old moon is sad. I mean, the moon is sad because it was, let me go, again, I gotta go just to this note. Let me read this, because I think it's, they promised, but despite the people's compliments and reassurances, the broken sun never stopped mooning over its golden days. And when it was alone in the sky, and the world had basked in its warmth, and that is why we call it the moon today. So yeah, that's a really good story, and a really fantastic explanation about why. I mean, like I said, we know why the moon is actually broken, but this is a great story about why, like, given by the people of Remnant for why it is broken, and just, like, the creation of the moon in general. That's a really good story. So I really liked that one. I thought it was a fantastic reflection, like I said, again, on how people tend to, created stories as explanations for certain parts of our world, or in this case, the world of Remnant. So I really appreciated that. And, yeah, I think that's everything I had to say about all of these stories. And this was a really good book. And like I said, I just wanted to point this out. At least two of these stories have to do with Oz directly. I'm sorry, 3 of those stories. And those stories are, of course, The Infinite Man, The Story of the Seasons, and The Girl in the Tower. And they all either directly or indirectly involve Oz in some way. The Girl in the Tower, hell, this story predates Remnant, kind of. It predates the Remnant we know. This is before humans were originally wiped out. So the fact that like, Salem, because this story is mostly focused on Salem, obviously, the Girl in the Tower, that's Salem. So the fact that, but of course Ozma is mentioned in the story, even if not by name, and neither of them are mentioned by name specifically, but the fact that this story survived, and the way it's described, really, the only 2 people who could have told this story are Oz and Salem respectively, and I don't think Salem would have told this story. I mean, maybe during that brief time when they were ruling together and were considered gods by the people, maybe. But I would be willing to bet that the person who actually kept this story alive, at least to a certain extent, was Oz. Maybe not as to the modern day, but maybe he was the one who originally told it so long ago. I don't know, because the fact that this story survived is amazing to me. And, of course, the other two stories about Oz obviously happened after humanity came back. Obviously, there's him giving his powers to the maidens, but then there's also the Infinite Man, which is basically just a reflection on the many, many lives that Oz has lived. And it's fascinating, not just because of the stories themselves, but what's interesting about the two stories that occur after humanity came back and focus on Oz in one way or another, of course, is just how attached he's able to stay when it comes to these events that he actually lived through. He's able to, like, talk about them and describe them in the book in such a way that, you know, you would, if we didn't know Oz was involved, or at the very least, if we didn't know the full story of the Lost Fable, it would be very hard, like, to see, like, know anything. And even just the case of the Infinite Man, as described there, it's very amazing, because that one is particularly sad. I mean, obviously, the girl in the tower might probably be a little bit sadder, at least from Oz's perspective, because it's about his earliest life, and it's about this woman he used to love. Again, how much of the personality that we know as Ozpin is Ozma, how much of it is the collective consciousness of all these guys combined is still in question to a certain extent. But regardless, it's very interesting to consider, because obviously, like, he was there and he's talking about these things as if they didn't actually happen or that they're fictional, when in reality we know that, at least to a certain extent, these things are probably pretty accurate descriptions of events in his actual life. So it's fascinating to go over them and actually see that in the writing. But and again, the Infinite Man one is actually a fairly good reflection on all of his lives, because we get 3 of his lives, some more than others, but like one more than the other 2, but we do get at least 3 of his many, many lives in the Infinite Man story. And what's interesting about them is how sad that story really is, because if anything, I think that's the greater piece to reflect on. And like I said, I thought that story was one of my favorites in the book, really. As for and again, I don't know, I just find how he's able to completely lie about any involvement he might have had. Granted, nobody would believe him anyway, except for those who are already involved within his inner circle. But the fact that they all, like, that nobody would believe it, it's still amazing that he's able to stay so detached. I don't know, I find that fascinating. Anyway, I think I've said all I wanted to say about these 2 books. I want to say that I really enjoyed them, but otherwise I think I gave my thoughts in one way or the other. So, yeah. It's good to be back. I think I enjoyed this quite a bit, talking about these books and just having a good time in general when it comes to talking. Talking, that's what I'm going to be doing going forward in one way or another. Obviously, I'm going to try and mix things up a bit, but I'm basically going to be just me talking about different things that I enjoy, one way or the other. Geeky stuff, you know, because that's what I'm all about. But anyway, this is Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and I hope you all enjoyed this video, because I sure enjoyed sitting down to make it. And please, if you feel so inclined, do come back to visit me again in the future. I really would love to hear from you. Thank you, and I hope you have a good day.